As we've all observed, our teachers have faced an uphill battle to keep us motivated throughout the pandemic. Our next speaker is well aware of these struggles, but is more interested in what we can take away and learn from this year of confusion and uncertainty. Justin Reich is the director of the MIT Teaching Systems Lab, which aspires to prepare teachers for the classroom through research and design. In addition to this, he hosts the Teach Lab podcast and is the author of Failure to Disrupt: Why Technology Alone Can't Transform Education. You'll find links in the chat for both. Justin has actively been working to understand which elements of remote learning should be kept following the pandemic. Justin, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your findings with us.
Thanks, Zaid. Well, as you mentioned, our day job is studying teacher learning and how teachers learn. But one of our main concerns during the pandemic was the idea that there are lots of people studying test scores, there are lots of people studying online learning environments, but there weren't a lot of people who were studying the lived experience of students and teachers inside schools. So I want to tell you today about a little bit of research that we've done, but also using a very simple interview protocol, a very simple set of interview questions that you can use in your school, with your teachers, with your colleagues, to help you do some of this research and to be more informed as you go about your advocacy for helping your schools and helping California schools build back better. So what happened in schools during the pandemic? In some ways, we all had a really shared experience in the sense that, all of our schools closed, we pivoted to remote learning. Later in the year, we had these weird hybrid learning models. But another key insight that we have talking to teachers and students is that everyone is having a really different pandemic. You can even see in the Q&A in the discussion, there's someone just asked the question, if I failed one of my A through G classes, can I take it again through UC Scout? There were some students for whom the pandemic was a devastating experience to their mental health, to their academics. And if you're one of those students, my heart really goes out to you. It was also the case that there was a smaller number of students who actually really thrived during the pandemic. There's some students who went to school every day and they experienced social anxiety or bullying or racism or prejudice, and they got to stay home in the loving arms of their family and discover that they liked the independence that the pandemic offered. They liked the freedom to navigate their own learning a little bit more. So in some ways, we all had a shared experience. But in some ways, we actually all had a really different pandemic, and understanding that different pandemic that we each had is an important part of moving forward and building back better. I thought I would ask you all a couple of questions, and Zaid, maybe you'll even be willing to share some of these, but I think Cassie's going to put up a poll for you. And I want to ask you one question first. How have you fared academically during the pandemic? Are you someone who feel like you really thrived, you really benefited from not experiencing the distractions of being in school? Or you kind of survived or made your way through? Or were there folks who felt like, they really suffered academically during this period? Zaid, would you be willing to share sort of your response to that question while folks are voting?
Yeah, because I can't vote via the poll, I'd say that probably academically I survived. Personally, I think I thrived.
That's great. That's great to hear. Yeah, so for me, I actually sort of different experience. I think and Cassie would love to see the responses to the first poll. Good. So we got about, 45% thrived, 45% survived, 10% suffered. You all are probably unusual then. If we did this with every California student, we probably wouldn't get the same distribution of answers there. So that's something really important to keep in mind as you think about your roles as leaders and your roles as advocates, that your experiences might be really different from other folks' experiences. Cassie, would you ask the second question? Same thing, but how did you fare personally during the pandemic? To what extent did you thrive? To what extent did you survive? To what extent did you suffer? So for me, academically, I think I had, academically is a little different for me because, you all are in grade 10, 11, and 12, and I'm in grade 33 or something like that. But I had a pretty positive professional experience, but just a really hard year. And I had a very comfortable experience during the year. But it was just really hard and really isolating and really lonely for me. So Cassie, maybe you can show us when this comes up, what the responses are. So, sort of more actually, more of a balance here. Some thriving, some surviving, some feeling like they're suffering. Again, my heart goes out to you who had a really hard time, either academically or personally during this experience. But everyone had a different pandemic. There's some of you who might have been double thrivers out there. There's some of you might have been like, oh, this is actually kind of great. Here's another paradox that shows up in pandemic education. Your teachers made an extraordinary effort over the past year to completely on a dime transform schools to support remote and hybrid learning. But a sort of strange thing that also emerged is when they transformed schools to operate remotely, they conserved almost every major part of schools. So for so many schools, what they were doing remote, but they were using learning management systems to pass documents back and forth instead of folders. They were using Zoom to have teachers lecture at students during 47-minute periods. We kept the same classes, we kept the same timings, we kept the same structures. Even though we know that that might not be the best way to conduct an online education for students. There's a type of Japanese theater called kabuki, where people dress in this sort of big fancy makeup and big costumes, and then they do these really mundane kinds of things. And it's just sort of otherworldly combination of the totally different and the very familiar. And in some ways, pandemic schooling was like that. So we have all these different experiences. In some ways, schools have changed dramatically. In some ways, schools have very much stayed the same. So that leads us to the question, like, what is this going to be like next year? What are the ways that we're going to take what we learn from all these different experiences and be able to build back better and build forward? And I think there are three possible stories for next year. And I'm going to really advocate for you all to push for one of them. The first possible story is what we might call the status quo ante pandemus for the Latin nerds. Or we're going to sort of go back to what things were like in 2019. And it's understandable that there'd be a sense of nostalgia for pre-pandemic times, but the schools that we had in California and the United States were not good enough for all students in 2019. You just heard that there are 400 schools in California where you can't take the classes that you need to get into CSU and the UC system. That is not good enough. The schools that we had in 2019 are not good enough, and we shouldn't go back to them. A second thing, for those of you who are policy nerds, you've probably heard a ton. We heard it just recently about this idea of learning loss. And there's a whole bunch of folks who've said, well, we should use standardized tests to evaluate the gaps in students' standards-aligned curriculum knowledge. And then we should remediate that with high dosage tutoring and acceleration courses. The problem with that model, which was very successful at creating an advocacy for federal funding, is that there's actually very little salience of that model on the ground in classrooms. If you talk to young people about what they lost this year, they might talk a little bit about the learning they lost, but they'll talk a ton about the social experiences they lost, about the field trips they missed, about the transition experiences, about the ceremonies, about the times they had with friends. Young people's minds aren't really wrapped up in learning loss. They're wrapped up in the social loss. So here's a third model that I think we should aim for next year, which is that we should start by listening and learning from the teachers and students who survived or thrived or suffered through this pandemic year. There is exactly one generation of young people who have gone to school remotely during a pandemic, and it's you all. There's all kinds of things where the adults in the building might know more about schools than you do, but this is one area where they don't. The adults in your building don't know what it's like to be a student during a year like this, and they really need to listen to you and listen to your experiences and figure out where you're coming from if we're going to be able to build back better, if we're going to be able to take what worked this year, what didn't work, and use that insight to evolve and improve. So we've been doing this project called Imagining August. On the East Coast, we call it Imagining September because our schools start a little later. And we're asking teachers to interview their students and to ask them 5 questions. What aspects of remote learning that you've most appreciated would you like to see carried forward into in-person schooling? What was really hard about remote learning that you hope you never have to manage again as a student? After this pandemic, what do you hope adults will do to make in-person school better for next year? And what do you hope they don't do to school next year? Zaid, I'm hoping that when we finish this little bit, you'll give me some insights on that. What do you feel like you missed out on or lost because of the pandemic in school this year? And then what are you most proud of for this year? So we've had about 250 teachers who've asked 4,000 plus students these questions. And the answers, which we've had people send back to us with a little survey link, they really fall in 4 categories. We need schools that help people heal. For those that had sickness and death and loss and trauma in their lives, schools need to be places in August and the fall where some of that healing can begin to take place. One of the things that young people most appreciate about their teachers this year is that oftentimes there was a newfound level of empathy and understanding of the kinds of things that were going on in students' outside lives that were affecting their school lives. That's something that we have to ask teachers to preserve. If there are things that your teachers did really well during the pandemic, as an advocate, as a leader, you really have to tell them, we know that you all as young people, you respond to positive feedback. Well, guess what? The adults in your life do too. One of the things you can do as leaders and advocates is there are things that were working this past year that you want to continue. You got to tell people that they were working. That students and teachers want a renewed sense of the importance of community. As one teacher said, I used to think of community as like a little mini unit I did at the beginning of the year, but now I know it has to be something that we do all year long and that we can't go back to the new normal. We need to think about this coming year as a process of reinventing our schools to be more resilient, both for future challenges. When you look at the heat wave, which is cascading across California and the West right now, we know because of the climate emergency that schools are going to close more often in the future. And we have to be able to build schools that are resilient to these kinds of interruptions and changes. So my advice for you, my toolkit for you as advocates is collect the stories of your peers, of your teachers from pandemic schooling. We have a website, bit.ly, Imagining September 2021, which has slides for K-5 students, slides for 6 through 12 students, slides in Spanish. You can remix them and reuse them however you want. Encourage the teachers, the principals, the superintendents in your lives to use these resources to try to get a better understanding of what youth experienced during the pandemic. And if they won't do it for them. You don't have to wait for leaders to move. You can be the leaders. Gather your peers, gather some teachers, bring people together informally, ask them these questions, promise that you'll take their answers seriously, and your peers will give you serious answers that can really inform what adults and what all of our community members do to build school back better next year. For those of you who are students of Cesar Chavez and his organizing in California, you might recognize some of this as the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. We reflect on our own experience, the story of self during the pandemic. We collect a shared set of stories, the story of us during the pandemic, and then it's our job to figure out the story of now and what we're going to do next. So those are some tools that you can use to move forward. And I'm excited to take a few minutes to chat with you, Zaid, about what should happen next.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that just incredibly passionate presentation. I feel like we could all feel your passion through the screen, Justin. But we do have some questions for you. And the first question comes from Sam, who asks, in the next pandemic, or in this case, in California's case, fire season, if we should have to return to distance learning, what should we do differently?
Man, that's a great question. And it's a really, really local question. There are 130,000 schools and 13,000 school districts in this country, and they all might have different answers to this. But I think, if I had one nationwide answer to this question, is a totally messed up thing that we did in this country is we said, who should provide the social safety net for young people and their families is schools. And that's crazy. Teachers should teach. And they should worry about the learning and the human development of their students. And there should be nutrition, food assistance programs, social welfare programs, mental health programs, housing assistance programs. It shouldn't be the job of schools to figure out all these kinds of things. Schools should figure out teaching and learning. So if there's one thing that we can do as citizens, it's advocate for a stronger safety net for young people and their families that operates really effectively during normal times. So that during these hard pandemic, climate emergency kinds of times, that safety net is ready to go. And teachers, and bless educators' hearts, they'll do anything for their kids, but they shouldn't have to. They should get to focus on teaching and learning.
Definitely agree. I feel like we've put so much pressure on teachers to the point where, as we're seeing in the news, many teachers are starting to, retire early or leave the profession, and that's incredibly concerning. Another question comes from one of our students who asks, I've had a teacher who had a class she enjoyed taken away from her and replaced by another that is equally as important. How can I help this teacher?
Man, it's not always clear that you can. Schools are complicated places. I actually spend a lot of my life sort of studying principals, studying superintendents. I have a lot of sympathy for those folks. They're managing a lot of complex concerns. I hope that every school community is a place where you feel like you can express your concerns, where you can just say aloud that something wrong. It's quite possible that you can't figure out sort of all of the things that are going on behind the scenes and all of the things that are being balanced, but you should always feel like you have a chance to express your views. And, even though you're only in, your high school for 4 years or something like that, do take the long view. Things do change in schools. They can't always change in the time that you're there. But talk to your teachers, talk to your principals. They say, okay, if we can't fix this for this coming semester, like what can we do to make this situation be better a year from now, 2 years from now, those kinds of things.
Agreed. Lexi asks, do you think virtual platforms can improve civic engagement opportunities for students?
I think they can. But they can also be really effective mechanisms for disinformation and misinformation and conspiracy theories and craziness. It's not necessary, so technology is now essential to organizing. If Cesar Chavez was alive today, I'm sure he would be on TikTok and on Snapchat and on all of these other platforms because that's where the people are. But that doesn't mean that his organizing would necessarily be better. Part of what's going to help us figure out whether virtual platforms are really great civic platforms in the future is if we as citizens embrace civic values of a shared reality, of a commitment to democracy, of those kinds of things. I mean, technology is going to change some of this stuff. One of the most concrete things that we can do is make sure that we're getting really good information and only sharing good information online. And I'll try to drop in the chat a link to a course that we're teaching this year called Sorting Truth from Fiction, Civic Online Reasoning, that might be able to help with some of those things.
Definitely. Thank you so much for dropping that in the chat. Sam asks, should school districts allow students to opt for online learning again in fall 2021?
Man, this is a hard question. So I'll try to do it quickly. There are a bunch of virtual schools that operate in the United States, and most of them are terrible. They have really bad outcomes for kids. We have not in this country done a great job of figuring out what good online learning options, but probably some of what's behind Sam's question is there's some kids and families who are probably concerned about health things and stuff like that. There's a lot of families who just discovered, hey, actually online learning is better for my students. I like this better. So there's going to be a bunch of districts that experiment with district level, single district virtual schools, and they're going to have a hard time. Because, this is a little bit connected to another question that folks have, which is like, what steps should we take to change educational systems, whether we want to make online schooling or other kinds of stuff? Here's a really important thing to keep in mind. Your teachers, your educators, your school leaders, they're exhausted. They are world historically exhausted. There's never been a group of more tired teachers, but they also, here's the paradox, they have this understanding that they can change things. Teachers changed a lot this year. There's a lot of stuff that we thought we could never possibly move that we moved. So there's things that we can do differently, but we're kind of exhausted. So for us, that's why this idea of sort of reflection and storytelling and ongoing conversation is so important. Your schools, your teachers, they're not going to fix all this stuff by September. They're going to go sit up on the beach or sit in the mountains, and they're going to have a well-deserved rest. But we should be thinking about making all of these changes. And the way that we see going forward is let's talk with each other about our experiences. Let's try to figure out what worked really well for students, what we got rid of that was really good to get rid of, that really benefited students, and how we can take this power that we've discovered that we have to change and not just apply it during a crisis and an emergency, but keep applying it year after year moving forward. If we celebrate our resilience, if we celebrate what we're proud of, if we mourn our losses, and we think and talk really hard about what worked and what didn't, that's going to be the blueprint for figuring out these things like online schooling, like educational change, other stuff like that. But it really does start to some extent by capturing these kinds of stories. And so that's what I hope the Imagining September project will help folks do.
Awesome. Justin, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day and for speaking with us. And we just hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks. Best to you all as well.